The Mystical Evolution in the Development and Vitality of the Church, Part 8. Appendix 1. The Divine Espousal. From the Interior Castle, Fifth Mansions, Chapter 4. All giving and taking have now come to an end, and in a secret way the soul sees who this spouse is that she is to take. By means of the senses and faculties, she could not understand in 1,000 years what she understands in this way in the briefest space of time. But the spouse, being who he is, leaves her, after that one visit, worthier to join hands, as people say, with him. And the soul becomes so fired with love that for her part she does her utmost not to thwart this divine betrothal. If she is neglectful, however, and sets her affection on anything other than himself, she loses everything, and that is a loss every bit as great as are the favors he has been granting her, which are far greater than it is possible to convey. So, Christian souls, whom the Lord has brought to this point on your journey, I beseech you, for his sake, not to be negligent, but to withdraw from occasions of sin. For even in this state, the soul is not strong enough to be able to run into them safely, as it is after the betrothal has been made, that is to say, in the mansion which we shall describe after this one. For this communication has been no more than, as we might say, one single short meeting, and the devil will take great pains about combating it and will try to hinder the betrothal. Afterwards, when he sees that soul is completely surrendered to the spouse, he dare not do this, for he is afraid of such a soul as that, and he knows by experience that if he attempts anything of the kind, he will come out very much the loser, and the soul will achieve a corresponding gain. 2. Exchange of hearts. Says Father Weiss, the exchange of hearts is a common phenomenon in the lives of the saints. Often it was outwardly manifested in a wonderful manner, as we read in the lives of St. Catherine of Siena, St. Catherine de' Ricci, St. Luitgard, and others. But in all the saints it was, to some extent, verified internally. Hence, many things in their lives are incomprehensible, for the exterior is the expression of the interior. 3. Impulses and wounds of the spirit. From the Interior Castle, Sixth Mansion, Chapter 2. Before the soul is wholly united to him, the spouse fills it with fervent desire, by means so delicate that the soul itself does not understand them, nor do I think I shall succeed in describing them in such a way as to be understood, except by those who have experienced it. For these are influences so delicate and subtle that they may proceed from the very depth of the heart, and I know no comparison that I can make which will fit the case. All this is very different from what one can achieve in earthly matters, and even from consolations which have been described. For often, when a person is quite unprepared for such a thing, it is not even thinking of God. He is awakened by His Majesty, as though by a rushing comet or a thunderclap. Although no sound is heard, the soul is very well aware that it has been called by God, so much so that sometimes, especially at first, it begins to tremble and complain, though it feels nothing that causes its affliction. It is conscious of having been most delectably wounded, but it cannot say how or by whom. But it is certain that this is a precious experience, and it would be glad if it were never to be healed of that wound. It complains to its spouse with words of love, and even cries aloud, being unable to help itself, for it realizes that he is present but will not manifest himself in such a way as to allow it to enjoy him, and this is a great grief, though a sweet and delectable one. Even if it should desire not to suffer it, it would have no choice. But in any case it would never so desire. It is much more satisfying to a soul than is the delectable absorption, devoid of distress, which occupies in the prayer of quiet. So powerful is the effect of this upon the soul that it becomes consumed with desire, yet cannot think what to ask, so clearly conscious is it of the presence of its God. Now, if this is so, you will ask me what it is desires or what causes its distress. What greater blessing can it wish for? I cannot say. I know that this distress seems to penetrate its very bowels, and that, when he that has wounded it draws out the arrow, the bowels seem to come with it, so deeply does it feel this love. Here all the senses and faculties are active, and there is no absorption. They are on the alert to discover what can be happening, and, so far as I can see, they cause no disturbance, and neither increase this delectable pain nor remove it. Anyone to whom our Lord has granted this favor will recognize the fact on reading this. He must give him the most heartfelt thanks, and must not fear that it may be a deception. Let his chief fear be rather lest he show ingratitude for so great a favor, and let him endeavor to serve God, and to grow better all his life long, and he will see the result of this and find himself receiving more and more. It may be that you wonder why greater security can be felt about this than about other things. For the following reasons, I think. First, because so delectable a pain can never be bestowed upon the soul by the devil. He can give pleasures and delights which seem to be spiritual, but it is beyond his power to unite pain with tranquility and joy in the soul, for all his powers are in the external sphere, and when he causes pain, it is never, to my mind, delectable or peaceful, but restless and combative. Secondly, this delectable tempest comes from another region than those over which he has authority. Thirdly, great advantages accrue to the soul, which, as a general rule, becomes filled with a determination to suffer for God's sake and to desire to have many trials to endure, and to be very much more resolute in withdrawing from the pleasures and intercourse of this world, and other things like them. 4. Relation of the espousal to mystical marriage. From the Living Flame, stanza 3. In this matter, however, it is well to note clearly the difference that exists between the possession of God through grace in itself alone and the possession of him through union, for the one is a question of mutual love and the other is of communication. There is a great difference between these states, as there is between betrothal and marriage. For in betrothal there is only a consent by agreement, and a unity of will between the two parties, and the jewels and the adornment of the bride-to-be given her graciously by the bridegroom. But in marriage there is likewise communication between the persons and union. During the betrothal, although from time to time the bridegroom sees the bride and gives her gifts, as we have said, there is no union between them, for this comes at the end of the betrothal. Even so, when the soul has attained to such purity in itself and in its faculties that the will is well purged of other strange tastes and desires, according to its lower and higher parts, and when it has given its consent to God with respect to all this, and the will of God and the soul are as one in a free consent of their own, then it has attained to the possession of God through grace of will, and in so far as can be by means of will and grace. And this signifies that God has given it, through its own consent, his true and entire consent, which comes through his grace. And this is the lofty state of spiritual betrothal of the soul with its word, wherein the spouse grants the soul great favors and visits it most lovingly and frequently, wherein the soul receives great favors and delights, but these have nothing to do with those of marriage, for the former are all preparations for the union of marriage, and though it is true that they come to the soul when it is completely purged from all creature affection, for creature betrothal, as we say, cannot take place until this happens. Nevertheless, the soul has need of other and positive preparations on the part of God, of his visits and gifts, whereby he purifies the soul ever more completely, and beautifies and refines it so that it may be fitly prepared for such lofty union. During the time, then, of this betrothal and expectation of marriage in the unction of the Holy Spirit, when there are choicest unctions preparing the soul for union with God, the yearnings of the caverns of the soul are wont to be extreme and delicate. 5. Entrance into the night of the Spirit and the beginning of the transforming union. A short time before receiving the religious habit, Maria Busto, afterwards Mother Mary of the Queen of the Apostles, wrote as follows to her director. The union of my soul with God seems to have become much more intense and intimate, although much more spiritual and imperceptible than formerly. I feel as if the depth of the soul were aflame with that fire about which I have often spoken to you, though now I experience it in a different way. It is as if the flames which consume me spring forth from God himself and unite me to him in a manner that it is impossible to explain. It is totally different from what I have told you on other occasions. What experience now is something much more profound, interior, secret, and hidden even from myself. The suffering in this union is not mixed with any of the sensible consolations which I felt on previous occasions, but I willingly put aside even the slightest consolation because it seems to me that this union would be much more pure without them. Another thing that causes me intense suffering is that the more vividly I experience God, the more I discover the affinity which I have yet to experience. Believing my soul to be full, I find myself empty because of the great longing I have to experience even more. Therefore, when the union is increased, the derelictions and abandonments are more horrible. Many times I feel myself interiorly consumed by the pain of loss which results from the separation of God. I find that I am unable to endure such suffering, and I feel a noticeable decline even in the body. In a word, I can say that all the changes which I experience interiorly consist in suffering, but the suffering takes on various forms. Yet, thanks be to God, I desire nothing else because I believe that in this consists my only true life. Now, Father, I notice that I am in a better state when I suffer more, and although the manner of suffering once terrified me, like the suffering in hell itself, I have almost arrived at a point of desiring it. I do not know if it is the suffering or myself that is changed. The night of the Spirit. That God may dwell permanently in the soul, that both he and the soul may become one, that the soul may feel his presence in the depth of its being. It is necessary not only that the potencies be purified so as not to offer any obstacle of the divine activity or the manifestation of the activity through the infused virtues and gifts, but this purification must penetrate the very center of the soul, The soul must be raised up from the condition to which it was reduced through the fall, so that it may be in perfect harmony with the right spirit, which will vivify it and unites God and the soul in one life. In this way, the spirit becomes the soul of its life and the life of its soul. And the soul adheres to God in such a way that it lives more in him than it does in himself. This new state requires powerful and terrible purgations which are incomparably more painful than anything yet experienced. They are much more intense and subtle and so penetrating that they touch the very core of the soul. Like a burning fire and a divine astringent, they leave the soul entirely purified, white, and shining. All this takes place during the night of the Spirit. St. John of the Cross, in describing the pains of the night of the senses, which, we have already seen, are very great, considers them light indeed when compared to those of the night of the Spirit. When writing of the latter, he shudders and hardly dares to describe them. He says that they are not only terrible, but almost intolerable, and that they can be compared to no other pains but those of purgatory, or hell itself. It is in purgatory that the majority of just souls must endure those pains, since they did not endure them in this life. For no one can see God face to face. No one can gaze upon his sanctity and purity without first dying to the old Adam. That is, without being completely rectified and totally purged of the last vestige of sin and the slightest shadow or blemish. It will be understood, on the one hand, how necessary are the bitter pains which the blessed souls suffer in purgatory, and especially those souls that have undergone scarcely any purgation during life. On the other hand, one can understand the love and willingness which these souls accept their suffering and ardor, with which they desire it in order to appear worthily before the majesty of God, and not filled with stains and confusion. They would not be able to withstand his eternal splendor if they were not totally pure and transparent. Yet they cannot help but desire him with a most vivid longing once his divine enchantment is to some extent manifested to them. So these souls seek purgatory as their only remedy, and they look upon it as a marvelous invention of divine love, which does not wish to deprive of eternal glory the many souls that die in the state of grace without being completely purified. One can see from this what a low idea of God's infinite sanctity and purity is held by those unfortunate heretics who attribute our justification to a simple imputation of the merits of Jesus Christ, without the removal of the stains and ugliness of sin from the soul. Because of this grave error, they also deny the necessity of purgatory. It is certain that nothing stained can enter heaven. Accordingly, as there must be a definitive degree of union and possession of God which will determine the soul's vision and glory, so also there must be a corresponding degree of renewal and purification. If the purification is accomplished in this life, it increases the soul's merit and union through grace. And if it is voluntary, it is much milder and sweeter. But if purification is delayed until after death, it will lack merit, and since the soul's degree of union and essential perfection will not be increased, neither will its glory. As a purification imposed upon the soul, it will possess a certain mechanical aspect which will make it much more rigorous, prolonged, and intolerable. It will be a sort of hell where the souls suffer an anguish incomparably exceeding anything we can imagine. When, at the height of contradiction, those heretics accuse us of placing all religion and justice in useless works, ignoring the interior for the exterior rather than adoring and serving God in justice and in truth. They do not stop to think of the stupendous renewal which is experienced by souls that arrive at this state, nor do they realize that such souls are living a life which is truly divine. This marvel is such that the sincere Protestants can recognize, in spite of everything else, the high degree of sanctity and the sublime Christian spirit which is found in many great mystics of the Catholic Church, and they cannot help but admire them. But our admiration is nothing compared to what is owing to these generous servants of God who, determined to follow Christ in the agonies of the cross, strive to be perfectly configured to him so that they will be entirely renewed and will have nothing to purify in the next world. Because they have corresponded with grace, or sometimes, as a singular favor, God desires to manifest himself to these rare souls even in this life, and give them a foretaste of that which is yet to come. He infuses them with certain lights which are so superior to the light of faith that they seem to share in the lumen gloriae, which makes them endure their purgatory on earth, much to their merit and profit. In this state occurs the most of the sufferings encountered in the night of the senses: sorrows, afflictions, adversities, weaknesses, persecutions, calumnies, interior darkness, aridity, and desolation. Moreover, there are other pains, terrible beyond compare, the pains of loss which are entirely spiritual and affect not only the higher faculties, but the whole being, reaching to the very core of the soul. The suffering of this, quote, happy night, unquote, becomes so intolerable that it seems there could never be any sufferings that are greater. Nevertheless, these sufferings are renewed and increased from day to day so that the previous sufferings are forgotten, and all past sufferings are reckoned as nothing. By this suffering and capacity and the will to suffer are increased. To better understand these most painful spiritual purgations and the loving resignation which they are accepted, it should be noted that the very time the soul is casting off the remnants of the works of darkness, it is, without even adverting to it, putting on the armor of light in order to battle against its enemies. The soul realizes clearly that it is in a state of transition in which its renewal is still incomplete. The more it possesses God and the greater proofs of his love it receives, the more it desires to possess and receive, for the food of divine wisdom always produces a greater hunger. Therefore, every advance in illumination inflames the soul with more vivid desires, being clothed entirely in Jesus Christ, the true Son of Justice, and of being engulfed as soon as possible in the ocean of eternal life. The habitual state of the servants of God. The habitual state of the servants of God who have arrived at the espousal is one of continual violence. With the apostle, they groan and beg for perfect adoption, redemption from their servitude to the body, and the manifestation of the hidden glories of the sons of God. They yearn unceasingly for a more stable union and a more profound transformation. Seeing in themselves the numerous obstacles that prevent them from attaining what they so ardently desire, they suffer, as it were, agonies of death and the pains of hell, at the same time that they already enjoy a foretaste of glory by reason of that intimate and secret union in which they are gradually being deified. Therefore, in these souls is blended an insupportable suffering and an indescribable joy, without one impeding the other. The joy accompanies the possession of God, and the suffering struggles to break the bonds of death, which are obstacles to the complete union which the soul desires. The suffering of these souls are of all kinds, but what grieves them most, and the only thing that forces them to lament, is their separation from God. They see that he apparently hides himself from them as the souls themselves draw near to him, and they fear that they will always be deprived of his loving countenance. Thirsting for love, they sigh with ardent longings for him who is the eternal fount of living water, and they exclaim unceasingly, "When shall I come and appear before the face of God?" Their tears flow without ceasing and are a continual refreshment to them, while other creatures ask them, quote, "Where is thy God?" unquote. With such thoughts they endure the bitterness of death, and at the same time, in the innermost part of their spirit, they rejoice, amid wonderful peace, in the infinite good whom they belong. And no one can take this peace from them. To attain their renewal, they must yet enter into the bottomless abyss of the divine darkness where God is hidden from them. There, lost to themselves and deprived of all comforts and helps in their natural potencies, as well as that positive knowledge which they had of him, they witness the destruction of everything that formerly gave them consolation, and they suffer the horrors of absolute despoliation and total annihilation. They believe that all is lost and that they are absolutely blind, and thus they enter into the most wise ignorance, which surpasses all knowledge. With only one simple idea, to which all appearances is totally negative, they begin to possess the divine truth. They are sealed with the mystic seal of the light of love. Once the eyes of their intelligence are purified during the obscure darkness, they begin to perceive the splendor of the face of God and to see his ineffable being, which is comparable to nothing else. It is the eternal light which enlightens them and dissipates all darkness. Quote, "Then thy light shall rise up in darkness." Unquote. When the abyss of their own nothingness and the abyss of infinite allness of God are brought face to face, human nothingness dies entirely to self and lives now only for its God and its all. All the elements of death and darkness, which sin had injected into the soul, are destroyed by this living death. Not being able to offer any resistance, the soul's nothingness is completely overwhelmed, inundated, and permeated with the divine all which deifies it. This night does not properly consist, as does that of the senses, in a privation of lights. Rather, it is an excess of divine lights which, at the same time that it enlightens, burns and consumes the slightest imperfection, darkens, blinds, and completely confounds the soul. It paralyzes the soul's faculties and places it in a vast darkness. Suspended, as it were, in a chaos, the soul amid the horrors and calumnies surrounding it, sees in itself nothing but the abyss of its own nothingness and the complete lack of all good. This prodigious light, which darkens the soul to all things else, discloses to it the innermost secrets of its heart and makes it know the extent of its own vileness. It shows the soul the hidden traces of crafty self-love that vitiate even the best works. It makes the soul feel keenly the innumerable defects and hidden vices, which up to that time the soul did not even realize, much less root out. Seeing such an accumulation of stains and imperfections, the soul realizes that in the eyes of the infinite sanctity of God, it is absolutely impure, and even with the virtues which adorn it, is like a rag full of uncleanness. When the soul sees these things and feels them so keenly, it believes that it is destined for hell for all eternity, and there is no hope for it at all. It considers itself a culprit, already condemned and unworthy of pardon and mercy. From this proceed violent temptations to despair, which beset the soul and cause it consternation, at the same time that they purify and strengthen it. The soul feels incapacitated for all that God asks of it, and believes itself to be lost and beyond all remedy. Without being conscious of the fact, the soul burns with a love so pure and disinterested that what truly afflicts it in the midst of its fortunes is the fear of offending him who deserves infinite love, and the sorrow at not being able to make the satisfaction he deserves. This secret love is changed into a cruel sword, because it manifests to the soul and makes it feel very keenly the baseness of its faults, imperfections, and evil inclinations. Its incapacity for good and its propensity to evil, its paltry cooperation with the divine blessings, its bad use of graces received, the frequency with which it has resisted and grieved the Holy Ghost, and its weakness and remissiveness in following his inspirations. All these things afflict the soul extremely. Although the soul does not find in itself any grave sin and is firmly resolved never again to commit deliberately even the lightest fault, it believes that the greatest sinner would have made much better use of such graces, and that a tree as sterile as itself is good for nothing but the fire. It seems that it is already condemned. It cannot be comforted even in the most prudent advice offered by its director, for it thinks he does not understand and cannot understand. The soul thus judges either because this labyrinth is too complicated or because the soul, owing to the obscurity with which it finds itself, cannot explain, or, finally, because it fears that it will deliberately deceive the director in spite of its sincerity. The soul gains no comfort from hearing or reading the lives of the saints who found themselves in similar straits, for, although this gives a certain interior security, the soul begins to suspect that its own case is quite different. Actually, it is not, nor can it be exactly the same, because each soul must be tested in its own way, and the Holy Ghost, who breathes and works where he will, never repeats himself in effecting these prodigious marvels of love. As a crowning point of its sorrow and greatest test of its fidelity, God makes the soul oblivious to all favors that it has received, and even to those favors it received but a few moments earlier. Sometimes he makes the soul consider those things an illusion or a dream until he disengages it and then encourages it with other more evident favors, which both confuse and humble the soul. During this time, the soul finds itself in the midst of sadness, of the saddest and most painful anxiety. Seeing itself so violently wrenched from its peaceful condition, the soul appears, in the words of the prophet of the Lamentations, to have forgotten all good things, and it feels that it can never more recover them. The soul's inability to realize its ardent desires to improve its life makes it consider itself a maze of contradictions. It wishes to be holy, but it is filled with infinite malice. So inclined to evil, incapacitated for any good, does it find itself. Yet, this is not the soul's greatest torment. For without realizing, and even supposing the contrary, the soul still loves God truly and incomparably more than it loves itself. Its greatest torment lies in having displeased him and believing that it still offends him, however much it tries to resist the temptations which the enemies assail it. The soul deems that it has not loved God as much as it could have done, and it believes that it does not love him now, and that it will never be able to love him or atone for its faults. Therefore, although it seems that God is justly indignant with it, In the midst of its affliction and mortal agony, it cries out with a pure and even heroic love, quote, Lord, I deserve hell, but even there let me love thee as thou dost deserve to be loved, that I may not blaspheme thy holy name, and that my pains may in some measure atone for my lack of love. Unquote. If the soul could always burst forth in such affections, it would be of no small comfort. But it is so oppressed and its faculties are so bound and reduced to impotency that it finds not the slightest alleviation, support, or consolation. As St. John of the Cross says, the darkness which the soul here describes relates, as we have said, to the desires and the faculties, sensual, interior, and spiritual. For all these are darkened in the night as to their natural light, so that, being purged in this respect, it may be illumined in respect to the supernatural. For the spiritual and sensual desires are put to sleep and mortified, so that they can experience nothing, neither divine nor human. The affections of the soul are oppressed and constrained so that they can neither move nor find support in anything. The imagination is bound and can make no useful reflection. The memory is gone. The understanding is in darkness, unable to understand anything. And hence the soul likewise is arid and constrained, and all the faculties are void and useless. And in addition to all this, a thick and heavy cloud is upon the soul, keeping it in affliction and, as it were, far away from God. In another place, the saint writes, all this God brings to pass by means of this dark contemplation, where the soul not only suffers this emptiness and the suspension of these natural supports and apprehensions, which is a most afflictive suffering, as if a man were suspended or held in the air so that he could not breathe, but likewise he is purging the soul, annihilating it, emptying it or consuming in it, even as fire consumes the moldiness and the rust of metal. All the affections and imperfect habits which have contracted in its whole life, therein is understood the pain which is suffered in the emptiness and poverty of the substance of the soul, both in sense and spirit. Here God greatly humbles the soul in order that he may afterwards greatly exalt it. And if he ordained not that these soul feelings should be quickly lulled to sleep, then they arise within the soul. It would die in a very few days. The soul must resign itself to the will of the Father amid this terrible abandonment, striving to be faithful, trusting in him, and adjusting itself to live in this new manner, with a simple intuition which is tranquil and unchanging, as intense as it is imperceptible, and with a similar type of love. The poor soul does not realize that what it considers slothful is the culmination of activity, and that the soul is now more attentive than ever to God, and more desirous of pleasing him. With what great reason could the soul say without the prophet Isaiah, my soul hath desired thee in the night. Yea, with my spirit within me in the early morning I will watch thee. But the soul takes no account to these loving desires, and for that reason it laments its misfortune with great sorrow and bemoans its incapacity, its abandonment, and the sad state into which it supposes itself to have fallen. It believes that it has lost God forever, and it seeks him with agonizing sighs which tear at its heart. Although actually aflame with his love, the soul, believing itself to be cold and empty, begs a little spark of that heavenly fire. If the soul knew that its trials came from the hands of God, this knowledge would be a great comfort, and it would accept them with resignation. But it believes that it is forgotten by God and abandoned to the enemy who cruelly torments and persecutes it. While it suffers and languishes out of pure love, it unconsciously experiences the salutary effects of the hidden divine fire, which it renews it, and terrible astringent, which cleanses and purifies it. Ultimately, the soul realizes that in those bitter medicines it requires full health, which can be found only in true humility and purity. In that death of love is found the beginning of unending life. In this way, the soul is enabled to rise to the most sublime heights of contemplation and to see God in the most prodigious summit of the great divine darkness, wherein it sees the uncreated light, and hears the secret word of the Father. This living word of God, more sharp and penetrating than a two-edged sword, produces a kind of cleavage between the soul and the body, between the sensible and rational parts, thus causing the terrible mystical death. Later, in the mystical burial, it causes another division, even more profound, between the soul and the spirit. The spirit is henceforth engulfed in the divinity to enjoy a perpetual peace while the soul continues to suffer horribly. It seems to the soul that it is deprived forever of its God, and it suffers a total destruction amid the most profound grief. That the soul may not lose its life entirely because of such terrible sufferings, the Lord sometimes deigns to comfort the body while he burns and afflicts the soul, or he refreshes the soul with sweet consolations while the body is oppressed with sorrows and infirmities. Yet the greatest suffering of all consists in the fact that the soul does not yet realize that it is God himself who cauterizes it. If the soul but realized this, then that suffering would be received from his hand as the greater glory. Amid this painful anxiety, these horrors of an apparent abandonment, the mystical work of the soul's renewal and transformation is gradually consummated. After manifesting to the soul all its baseness and imperfections, that admirable divine light discloses the soul in the mysterious darkness of infinite good, which far surpasses everything that is knowable or desirable, and rejects and destroys everything that the soul has ever desired or known. That negative vision, which far surpasses any positive ideas which one could form of it, leaves the soul astonished and humbled, at the same time that it arouses in it a mortal eagerness to possess such a good. But this good as yet appears excessively lofty and too elevated for the soul to attain. Seeing at the same time its own baseness, it exclaims with St. Catherine of Siena, "Thou art the absolute being, I am nothing. Thou art pure goodness, I am malice itself. Thou art all perfection, I am the culmination of all imperfections and miseries." In this absolute contraposition, the soul believes it impossible that such contrary extremes can ever be united and associated with each other. It finds within itself a horrible contradiction to the supreme good, and, being unable to rid itself of all the things that are opposed to this goodness, it suffers agonies worse than death and exclaims with Job, quote, "Why hast thou set me opposite to thee?" Unquote. But in spite of this, the attraction of such goodness captivates the soul, melts and consumes it in unspeakable delights, while the apparent separation makes it suffer the horrors of hell itself. Thereby the horrible contradiction is somewhat dissipated, and the eyes of the soul are enlightened to see the divine glory more clearly and at closer range. In the measure that the Lord begins to manifest himself with his infinite enchantments during that darkness, shedding rays of light which reveal more and more the eternal and incomprehensible splendor of his infinite glory, the soul is gradually renewed and transformed in the midst of the most contradictory affections. At the sight of such majesty, grandeur, beauty, and goodness, the soul is thrown into ecstasy. Yet these very delights are so painful that there is no other pain comparable to them. The soul's ardent flights of love inflame and pulverize it while they destroy all its impurities and imperfections. They cause an ineffable pleasure which kills, and an unbearable pain which revivifies. Although the soul is unable to endure this pain, it does not wish to be deprived of it. It sees that lovable good, at sight of whom it swoons in ecstasy, manifests himself, as it were, forever to be inaccessible and unattainable. So the poor little soul thinks that it will never be able to reach him. This delicious pain is the greatest that can befall any soul. Elevated above itself and raised above all created things, the soul is unable to find any support in anything. It feels as if it were suspended in emptiness and were enduring the continual agony of death. Creatures fill it with horror, and yet feel repulsed by the uncreated good for whom it longs with the most ardent yearnings. It finds itself in a desolation which is extreme and an abandonment which is most terrible. Still, even in the midst of such martyrdom, it enjoys an indescribable peace. At the same time, says St. John of the Cross, the abyss of the divine majesty and grandeur discloses another abyss, that of the soul's poverty and misery. This is one of the greatest torments of this purgation, for both the senses and the spirit are oppressed and humbled beneath a great and invisible weight that they suffer, such a cruel agony that, if the soul were able to make a choice, it would prefer death to such a state. Even the most painful death imaginable would be accepted as a relief. Sometimes this agony endures not only for days, but for months and even years, until the soul, totally purified, is strengthened with virtue from on high to receive without pain the torrents of divine light. Then the soul will see, with great surprise, that the sovereign good which formerly it had deemed impossible of attainment is now very close to the soul, and that he fills it, satiates it, vivifies it, and divinizes it, being united to it so intimately that the soul is certain it can never lose him. Then the soul cries out in the midst of its heavenly joy, quote, "I have at last found him whom my soul loveth. I hold him, and I will not let him go." Unquote. But first the soul must be engulfed in the mysterious darkness in which he is hidden. It must mount and surpass all things on the wings of the Spirit, beyond all things imaginable, all things knowable, all things created, all things that are conditioned. In a bold contemplation, the soul must be raised above all the vicissitudes of time. It must become totally blind, deprived of the natural lights it formerly possessed, with only the obscure and subtle light of faith by which it is able to peer into the serene regions of eternity, receive the rays of the uncreated light, discover the unknowable, the eternal, the absolute, and see in a simple gaze at the necessary and infinite being, the eternal reasons for all contingencies, changes, and limitations. It must, finally, be utterly oblivious to all creatures, that it may be able to see the creature in that indescribable abyss of the darkness, wherein are concealed the sacrosanct mysteries which are buried in his bosom from all eternity. When the soul is introduced to that state through the powerful influence of the Spirit who searches the most profound things of God, when it is submerged in that bottomless ocean of light and of beauties which are unknown and unsounded by any mortal, it swoons away. is absorbed and annihilated. It forgets all things and, losing itself, it finds all goods in one as well as all the delights and knowledge which it could never desire. It finds God in all, and its all, the God of its heart who is in its portion forever, and with the wise foolishness in which such a sight produces, it understands in one moment the whole science of salvation. In that divine darkness, whose enlightenment increases in proportion to its apparent obscurity, the wonderful grandeurs of the hidden God are manifested to the soul by degrees, and it continually receives the most pleasing and indescribable surprises. In that state, God himself gradually reveals his marvelous attributes, making the soul see at each moment the new and inconceivable enchantments. There, finally, he discloses to the soul the bottomless abyss of his incomprehensible essence, where it seems that nothing is seen, and at the same time everything is seen. There, between the two abysses of his allness and the soul's nothingness, the soul finds its glory and its delight. Reduced to an inability of loving and knowing as much as it desires, struggling, so to speak, in that ocean of light and of fire into which it has been thrust, the soul succeeds in one supreme enlightenment in discovering the enchantment of all the divine enchantments, the august mystery of the Trinity of persons and the absolute unity of nature. Then the transformation of the soul in God is completed, and the soul is able to celebrate that eternal divine marriage in which the creature is made forever one with the Creator. In the whole series of operations in which the Holy Spirit performs in the soul during the blessed night in order to effect the change from the conforming to the transforming union, two extremes which seem opposed to each other in the highest degree are joined together: the suffering of hell and the delight of an anticipated heaven. Not only are trying afflictions intermingled with certain sweet consolations, which gladden and give joy to the soul in the multitude of its sorrows, but even in the midst of its pains and tribulations, the soul is secretly overflowing with joy. This joy is so preponderant that, although the soul is experiencing affliction with the most profound pain, it is, as it were, no pain. Rather, it experiences an insatiable hunger for greater suffering in order to be more and more configured with Christ, to die with him and with him, to resurrect each day to a new grade of glorious life. Such souls know very well how valuable is one more degree of grace. They would consider well spent all the labors in the world in order to obtain a slightest growth in God. In this way, slowly and with almost being aware of it, the soul realizes in itself a marvelous renewal and transformation which are true prodigies of divine wisdom. That which no one could ever have imagined and which every created intelligence would have deemed impossible, an intimate, familiar, and vital fellowship in an ineffable transforming union of the finite with the infinite, is made possible by the good God. When the soul least expects it, it finds itself totally renewed, rectified, reformed, revivified, transformed, and divinized. Its stains and imperfections have disappeared like straws or drops of water in a flaming furnace, and with the disappearance of these obstacles, the divine being who had seemed so inaccessible invades the soul, transforms it, and assimilates it to himself, making it one with himself. Now the soul realizes that it is no longer what it was. It has become all light and fire, and is filled with divine truth, virtue, and strength. It is no longer the soul that lives, but God lives in it. Lost and utterly absorbed in the ocean of divinity, the soul seems to have lost its own proper being, its nature, even its personality, for it is now totally renewed and despoiled of the old man. The old ego, which caused conflict in all things, that selfish I, which gives the soul so much trouble and cost it so much effort, is no longer evident. Thou shalt seek his place, and shall not find it. There is now in the soul no other interest but the divine interest.